Looking at the next example, this is where we actually start solving for sides and values. Before we were just using the definitions to write ratios or to find the decimal of the ratio using a calculator. With these, when they start giving you variables to solve for, that's when we start using the rules to solve problems. So for this one, we're going to use the sine ratio to calculate the missing length. So finding the missing length, rounding the answers to the nearest hundredth. So looking at this one, here's the reference angle, and if we look at the sides that we've been given, this one's opposite, and this is our hypotenuse. So our sine function, or our sine rule, sine of an angle, is going to be opposite over hypotenuse. Is going to use those two sides. So in this case, we're doing sine of, and our reference angle for this one is going to be 40 degrees, is going to be equal to the opposite, which is x, over the hypotenuse is going to be 2. So we're using our algebra rules to solve for x. We want x all by itself on one side of the equal sign. And to do that, we need to multiply both sides by what's in the denominator. In this case, it's going to be 2. So if we simplify, 2 times the sine of 40 degrees is going to give us x, because the 2's cancel there. So it just leaves us with x. So we type that in the calculator is exactly as we see it. 2 times the sine of 40. So x is going to be approximately, and it wants us to round our answers to the nearest hundredth. So I'm going to write down 1.285. because this will be my hundredth spot, and that number determines whether it stays an 8 or it gets rounded up to a 9. So if we do that, we're going to end up with 1.29, and then our units for this one is going to be feet. Looking at the next example, we could also have a problem like this. If we look at our reference angle, this side is our opposite side. This side is our hypotenuse. So the trig function that uses opposite and hypotenuse is going to be sine. So sine of an angle is going to be equal to opposite over hypotenuse. So sine of an angle, and in this case the angle is 20 degrees, is going to be equal to opposite is 15 over the hypotenuse is going to be x. And our goal for this problem is going to be to get x all by itself on one side of the equal sign. So in order to do that, we need to multiply by the denominator just like we did over here, but in this case our denominator is going to be x. So if we multiply both sides by x, we're going to end up with x times the sine of 20 degrees is going to be equal to the x's here cancel, so that leaves us with 15. And our goal is to get x all by itself. The operation that's between x and the sine of 20 is multiplication. So to undo multiplication, we divide both sides by the sine of 20 degrees. And this is all one phrase, all one math phrase. You cannot separate the sine of 20 degrees. You've got to leave it all together. So divide the left side by sine of 20, divide the right side by sine of 20. So x, these two are going to simplify, is going to be equal to 15 over the sine of 20 degrees. So if we do that, we'll type in 15 over the sine of 20. So x is going to be approximately, and the calculator tells us 43.857 because it asks for the nearest hundredth. So there's our hundredth. The 7 is greater than 5, so we're going to have 43.86, and our units are meters. So the length of this side right here is approximately 43.86 meters, and the length of this side over there is approximately 1.29 feet. They could also ask you to solve for angles. So calculate the measure of angle x for each triangle. Anytime they're asking you to solve for an angle, you're going to be using an inverse operation. So they want angle x, and if we look at the sides that they give us in reference to angle x, this side right here is going to be the opposite, and this side right here is going to be the hypotenuse. So the trig function that uses opposite and hypotenuse is going to be sine. So we're going to do the inverse sine of opposite over hypotenuse is going to give us angle x. So the inverse sine, and then the opposite in this case is 4 square root of 3 over the hypotenuse is 8, is going to give us angle x. So if we type that in our calculator, we're going to hit second sine button, and that gives us the inverse sine. Notice it does the -1 just like it does in our problem. So we're going to do, I'm going to put parentheses around the 4 square root of 3 divided by 8, and close the parentheses, and there it gave us 60. So angle x is going to be equal to 60 degrees. And notice it says round to the nearest hundredth. Sometimes it'll be a nice whole number like this one was, and then sometimes it won't, and you'll have to use the decimal and round. They could also put these in word problems. Looking at the first example that I've got for you, a scout troop traveled 12 miles from camp. So they started there, went 12 miles that way. How far north did they travel? So they'll be traveling a certain amount east and a certain amount north from the camp. And they want to know the amount that they traveled north. And they want us to round our answers to the nearest hundredth. So if I'm looking at this one's the reference angle. This side's the opposite, and this side's our hypotenuse. And we look at our trig functions, the one that uses opposite and hypotenuse is going to be sine. So the sine of an angle is going to be equal to opposite over hypotenuse. And notice they gave us the angle, so that's how we know we're not using the inverse sine. So the sine of an angle, in this case it's going to be 18 degrees, is going to be equal to opposite, which we don't know, so it's x, over the hypotenuse, which is 12. So our goal is to solve for x, so we multiply both sides by the denominator. 12 times the sine of 18 degrees is going to give us x. So we type that straight into the calculator just the way we see it. And that gives us 3.708. And it wants us to the nearest hundredth. So x is going to be approximately 3.7, and the 8 is bigger than 5, so it's going to be a 1, and our units miles. Looking at the last one, the bleachers in a stadium are 4 meters tall and have a length of 12 meters. Calculate the measure of the angle, so this angle right here, the one with the question mark in it, formed by the bleachers and the ground. So here's the bleachers and the ground. So even if they didn't tell you, you should know that that's that one right there. So if we look at, this is our reference angle, and the sides that we want to, that we're working with are this side right here, which is the opposite, and then this side right there, this one is going to be our hypotenuse. And our trig function that uses opposite and hypotenuse is the sine of an angle is going to be equal to opposite over hypotenuse. So sine of an angle, in this case we don't know, sine of x is going to be equal to, our opposite in this case is 4 over 12. Well, they want us to solve for x. And if you set up your problem like this, it's okay. Just know that when you need to solve for x or for the angle, you've got to do the inverse sine. So the inverse sine of 4 over 12 is going to give us angle x. So type that in the calculator exactly as we see it. The inverse sine of 4 over 12 is going to give us 19.471, and it wants to the nearest hundredth. So angle x is going to be equal to 19.47 degrees. So that's our sine, our cosecant, and our inverse sine functions. Remember, sine is going to be your opposite over hypotenuse, and you're using that to write rules and to solve for a side. The cosecant of an angle you're just going to be using to plug values into your calculator. Remember, it's going to be 1 over sine of whatever angle degrees they give you. And that's how you find that in your calculator. And then your inverse sine is going to be used to solve for angles. If you have any questions, write them down and ask me when you get to class.